George III's sudden descent into madness baffled his doctors, but modern historians may have finally found the twisted cause of his illness. The Mad King, the man who lost America, Farmer George. There are a lot of things you could call George III, but boring certainly isn't one of them. As the leader of their enemies, the Americans villainized him, and his own subjects were quick to jump on the bandwagon. But was he really such a dire villain, or just a scapegoat? When the future King George III came into the world, it caused a flurry of panic. He was the firstborn son to Frederick, Prince of Wales, the heir to the British throne, and his wife Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, and he was 2 months premature. Since infant mortality was extremely high back then, George's parents feared for his life, and for his soul. They brought in the Bishop of Oxford to baptise him on the very same day of his birth, worrying that he may not even make it through the night. Yet, as the hours and then days passed, it looked like, against all odds, he might just pull through. George's survival seemed like nothing short of a miracle, and it came at a time when his father Frederick definitely needed one. Frederick, the Prince of Wales, was loathed by his own parents, and while they didn't mind their daughter-in-law, the Queen was suspicious of her. When Augusta first got pregnant, the Queen speculated that the child didn't belong to Frederick. Despite his family's low opinion of him, Prince Frederick was a pretty good dad to George III, and made sure he had a high-quality and well-rounded education. George III was actually the first king to have science as part of his schooling. Yet still, King George II didn't seem to care much about the boy, but all that was about to change. Just as George entered his teens, a tragedy completely changed his life. His father, Prince Frederick, died suddenly, leaving George without a father, and the throne without an adult heir. As you can imagine, his grandfather, King George II, was all of a sudden very interested in young George, his education, and his plans for the future. Now that he was next in line for the throne, the battle between George's mother and his extended family became much more intense. His grandfather wanted him to live at St. James's Palace, but his mother and her confidant, Lord Bute, wanted to keep young George under her watchful eye and convinced him to stay. In 1760, King George II perished just as suddenly as his son had, leaving George as the last man standing. At age 22, he took the throne as King George III. While he no longer had to deal with his grandfather and mother vying for his favour, he was still vulnerable to those who wished to treat him like a puppet. That's not to mention the fact that he was single and desperately in need of an heir. King George III had to get moving, and fast. Lord Bute presented George with a series of potential German brides, hoping to keep his position in the king's favour. No one thought that Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz was a contender for the position of queen. In fact, historical accounts mention that she was plain and had no particular talent or striking personality. But she came from a good family, didn't seem to have political motivations, and most importantly, she was in the right place at the right time. George III basically plucked her out of obscurity, and feeling that time was of the essence, he immediately proposed marriage. In 1761, Princess Charlotte and her entourage arrived in London for the very first time. Upon realising that not only was she going to lay eyes on King George for the first time, she was also going to marry him immediately afterward, the pressure overwhelmed her and she passed out. After being revived by her ladies-in-waiting, a dazed Charlotte met her man for the first time. Charlotte turned on the charm that evening and swept George off his feet. They tied the knot later that night. George's mother, the Dowager Princess Augusta, had married his father expecting to one day become queen. With that idea now out the window, she began to pull a serious evil mother-in-law act. Augusta may not have been able to control her son, but she did everything in her power to keep her daughter-in-law down, even installing spies among the Queen's ladies-in-waiting. It didn't take long for scandals to take root in George III's reign. Soon after his coronation, he had to deal with mortifying rumours about his mother. When Lord Bute schemed his way into the position of Prime Minister, people began to whisper that he and Princess Augusta were having an affair. George III had taken the throne at a particularly inopportune time. Britain was right in the middle of the 7 Years' War, a massive conflict the likes of which the world had never seen before. At first, the politicians in Parliament had accepted George, but when his old pal Lord Bute became Prime Minister, they turned on him. The rumours about Lord Bute and his mother had done real damage to George's relationship with the now Prime Minister, but if he wanted to get out of the trouble he was in, they were going to need to work together. By 1763, the conflict was bleeding the British dry, but luckily for them, the French were in even worse shape. There was an armistice and talks of peace, with leniency toward their opponents in Spain and France. There was just one problem. People saw it as a weakness, if not a straight-out betrayal of Great Britain by the King and Lord Bute. The end of the 7 Years' War marked a decisive victory for Great Britain, who got all kinds of territory out of it, including large parts of North America. Britain's victory meant that the American colonists had way more land to work with, but they wanted more. So when George III issued the Proclamation of 1763 limiting settler expansion and protecting Native American territory, their reaction was brutal. They saw it as a complete betrayal, and they weren't about to take it sitting down. George III didn't know it yet, but he was in major trouble. Lord Bute had long been one of George's closest confidants, but the fact that they couldn't get anything done in government without causing controversy or scandal wore on their relationship. Eventually, they could no longer work together, and Bute resigned in 1763. Once out of sight, Lord Bute was out of mind, and that meant that the king became the scapegoat for many of the decisions Bute had made as Prime Minister. Great Britain not only wanted to make up for all the money they'd lost, but they also needed to offset how much ongoing conflict with the native population in the US was costing them. With the full support of the king, the next Prime Minister, George Grenville, came up with the 1765 Stamp Act, and it immediately set off a huge wave of controversy. The Act instituted a tax on printed materials in the colonies, who saw it as a personal attack. After a lot of conflict and pressure, George III reluctantly agreed to appeal the Stamp Act. While the colonies celebrated his act and even erected a statue of him in New York City as a result, it would later come back to haunt him. The King and Queen had 15 children together, all but 2 of whom lived to adulthood. As far as birth rates go for that era, for royals, it was extraordinary. Despite their awkward start, George and Charlotte had really made things work. Not only did they actually love each other, but they'd also produced an heir and a spare, and then several other spares. However, the pressures of his reign were beginning to wear on George. In 1765, King George was temporarily struck by a mysterious mental disorder. His mother and her associates carefully monitored the king, while making sure to keep the full extent of the king's illness a secret from his own wife. And then, out of nowhere, he recovered. George was a straight-laced guy. He was religious, and unlike his predecessors, he didn't have any mistresses. His brothers, though, all participated in the family traditions of having multiple affairs and secret marriages to ladies the king did not approve of. George even tried to introduce an act forbidding members of the royal family from getting married without the king's permission. It was yet another half-cocked grasp at power, that no one listened to, and that only served to erode confidence in the king. Things were spinning wildly out of control, but George continued to place his faith in the parliamentary government. Things were getting more tense in the colonies, and his subjects there were tired of paying duties and taxes when they had no representation in British Parliament. There's one thing to know about British people, and that's don't mess with tea. No, really. The British really did see the ensuing Boston Tea protest and the destruction of tea as vicious and unlawful. George's role in all this caused the colonies to paint him as a tyrant, and they were just about ready to revolt. 13 British American colonies were tired of the way Britain was doing things, and they began to fight back. In July of 1776, they declared their independence from the British Crown, and thus began the American Revolutionary War. King George III valiantly tried to rally his inexperienced and unprepared ministers for a civil conflict, but then France got involved, further complicating matters. While the colonies had allies all over the world, namely countries that Great Britain had previously teed off, all that the British really had were the Loyalists. It was all falling apart before George's eyes. With what little power and resources he had left, George gathered 7,000 men to cross the Atlantic, but it was too little, too late. After numerous losses, George had no choice but to accept defeat. It would come to be the incident that tarnished his entire legacy. But first, he had to deal with the aftermath. After losing America, the British Parliament was in utter chaos. It shuffled through multiple prime ministers, few of whom George cared to work with, until he put his foot down and managed to get one of his allies, William Pitt the Younger, as PM. Against the odds, the people of Great Britain came to like Pitt and George as a combo. Pitt was an energetic leader, and George's subjects liked the fact that he was a family man. The king also gained sympathy when two of his sons died, one after the other, in 1782 and 83. Prince Alfred was just 1 year old, and Prince Octavius was 3. He felt the loss heavily, and it became yet another strain on his already fragile health. In the summer of 1788, King George had another breakdown, and this time it was much worse. He spent much of that period in a manic state. In November, his mental state deteriorated even more. He would talk for hours on end, leaving him foaming at the mouth and dehydrated. There was even an anecdote about him introducing himself to a tree, thinking it was the King of Prussia. His family struggled to keep it a secret, but within their ranks, someone was plotting. Queen Charlotte soon realised that someone was trying to keep her out of the loop about the king's situation. That someone turned out to be her eldest son, the Prince of Wales. He suspected that Charlotte wanted the throne for herself, while she believed that he might try and have his father declared insane to force his accession. And while this struggle for power was going on, doctors were struggling to help the king. Doctors knew little about mental disorders at that time, and so they had no idea what to do to help King George. During the time that George was unable to rule, Parliament struggled to come up with a solution. The king's eldest son, George, Prince of Wales, was already 26 and ambitious. The Prime Minister's rival, Charles James Fox, argued that the prince should act as regent. Pitt, who didn't get along with the boy, argued that Parliament should choose a regent, but then, just as Fox and the prince were about to get their way, they got a surprise. King George made a sudden recovery from his illness and returned to his post. He and Pitt, the Prime Minister, were working together successfully, and both were extremely popular. There were no two people this annoyed more than Fox, Pitt's nemesis, and the Prince of Wales, who had completely turned against his father. Much to their frustration, King George seemed more in command of both his power and his mental faculties than ever. For every success in his reign, like when he signed an act for the abolition of the slave trade in 1809, King George had to deal with some tribulation, like the French Revolution. While at first many of the European countries came together to denounce the revolutionaries, eventually they all left Great Britain standing alone in opposition to France and Napoleon. Many expected Napoleon to attempt an invasion, and the looming threat weighed heavily on everyone involved for months on end. The trouble with the French even caused a rift between George and his ally, William Pitt. The stress got to George, and he began to suffer brief relapses of his mental illness. William Pitt died at just 46, and Charles James Fox followed 9 months after. Against all odds, George was once again the last man standing. But you can't cheat fate forever. After losing one ally and one foe, King George found himself standing alone, mostly in opposition to the men in government. He was still enjoying the height of his popularity, but then tragedy struck. In November of 1810, George lost his youngest and most beloved child, Princess Amelia. She died after a battle with measles at just 27. It was at this moment that everything began to really unravel for King George. On top of his deteriorating mental health, George was dealing both with cataracts that left him nearly blind and a painful case of rheumatism. But more than anything else, it was the loss of his daughter that really broke him. He grieved for his daughter intensely. There were tears and a constant sense of melancholy. But as he lost his mind, his grief took a disturbing form. He would make heartbreaking pleas for Amelia, begging for her presence in bouts of insanity. At other times, George would speak to her as if she was in the room. George III, his court, his government, and his family were at a loss over what to do. But the king knew in his heart that the loss of Amelia had broken him forever. In 1811, he finally faced up to it, signing an act that named his eldest son, the Prince of Wales, as his regent. He had given up on his reign, but his story wasn't over yet. Sadly, caring for the king and occasionally stepping in to help the Prince of Wales act as regent took its toll on Charlotte's health. In 1818, she passed away at the age of 74, with her children by her side. King George was still holding on, but just as losing his favourite daughter had broken him, the Queen's loss had a devastating effect. By the time his wife was gone, the king had more or less become completely mad. Without Charlotte's care, he deteriorated rapidly. Perhaps it was a kindness when George himself followed her 2 years later, dying in 1820 as a shell of his former self. It was a truly tragic ending to their roller coaster story, but there were still many questions about what had caused the king to deteriorate so rapidly and dramatically. As doctors began to gain a better understanding of mental illnesses in the years after King George III's passing, many speculated about what could have caused his bizarre fits of mania. While some suspected porphyria, a genetic blood disorder, others have speculated that he may have suffered from bipolar disorder. But then, another possibility revealed itself. For centuries, the true cause of King George's health problems was unclear, until 2005, when scientists examined some of his hair. When they tested it, they found a surprisingly high amount of arsenic in it. Arsenic could be a potential cause for his mania. But where did it come from? Did he accidentally come into contact with it, or had someone poisoned him? If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more videos.